So last time we were together, we ended by mentioning this idea of profit maximization. Now let's take that idea of profit maximization and put it into practice and put something tangible behind it so we can see what that looks like. In order to do that, we're going to shift into an area of microeconomics that's referred to as market structure. Market structure is just what it says it is. It's looking at markets and how they're structured. Markets are structured in different ways. And depending upon certain characteristics, we can identify markets as one type or another. Primarily, when we look at market structures, we're trying to determine the difference along a spectrum or along a continuum, where we have on one side something that economists view as incredibly good, and then on the other side we have what's looked at as pretty bad. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at, on the one side, competition, and on the other side we're going to look at monopoly. So these are the two extreme market structures, and of course there's stuff in the middle, but if we understand the characteristics of the extremes, it makes understanding the stuff in the middle a lot easier. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what are the defining characteristics first, and then look at how those things apply to the competition on the one hand and monopoly on the other. The one thing they have in common, though, in fact, the one thing that all firms have in common when we look at market structure is that all firms are seeking to maximize profit. That's their single objective. So as we start to look at these different parts of, or these different aspects of market structure, it's all kind of swirling around the primary goal of a firm, which is to maximize profit. So we're going to be looking really at two things. We're going to be looking at the profit maximizing decision in more detail, and then we're going to also be looking at these characteristics for market structure. So let's get into it. When we're looking at market structure, there are four key determinants, four things we're trying to identify within the market to figure out what kind of market structure we're dealing with. The first thing is the number of firms, and this is the easiest thing to identify. On the one hand, with monopoly, we just have one firm in the market. And in competition, we have lots and lots and lots of firms. The second thing is, how easy is it to get into the market? And how hard is it to get into the market? Sometimes we refer to this as barriers to entry. Ease of entry and exit is something that distinguishes market structures almost as much as the number of firms. Because if it's easy to get into a market, if you can just say, today I want to be a farmer, or today I want to open a restaurant, if it's easy to get into, then you're more likely to be in a competitive market because there's lots of firms who can easily get in. Of course, if things aren't going well, you can easily exit. But if it's hard to get into an industry, and sometimes if it's hard to exit an industry, then you're more likely to be dealing with a monopoly. The third determinant is what we call market power, and that refers to what is your power to price your product. Now you might think that's a kind of a weird thing to think about. Why can't I just set whatever price I want? Well, with market power, you have power over price. You have the opportunity to set whatever price you want, but that doesn't mean your customers are going to pay it. Because if there's lots of other firms, if you have the opportunity to go somewhere else, if you don't like the price at one store, then you really don't have a lot of power over price. You can set whatever price you want, but if your customers look at that price and say, it's way too high, they just go somewhere else. So if there's lots of competition, you have very little power over price. But if you're a monopolist, you have lots of power over price. And then finally, we have what's called product differentiation. What this refers to is how different really is the product that you're selling versus what your competition is selling. And in in competitive markets, one of the problems for the seller is that the products that are being sold are very, very, very similar to each other. So again, if I don't like the price you're charging me, I can go right down the street or maybe right around the corner and buy something from someone that's almost exactly the same thing at a different price. So there's very little product differentiation in a competitive market. In a monopoly market, you might be the only one selling the thing that you're selling in the world. There may be nobody who sells exactly the same thing you do. So with monopoly, there tends to be a lot more product differentiation. So those are the key determinants. And as we look at competition and monopoly, we're going to be focusing on these specific things a little bit more carefully. So those are the things that make the firms different from each other and make market structures different from each other. But remember, I said that there's one thing that ties them all together, and that is the goal to maximize profits. Now, maximizing profits, as we've seen, is not as easy as it sounds. There are things we have to pay attention to, and you can't just produce whatever output you want and expect to make profits, because you've got to worry about revenues and costs. So as we try to understand better about how firms, or try to understand the process by which firms maximize profits, we need to keep that in mind. So let's start to break that idea down here as well. As we look at maximizing profits, the idea is going to apply to all firms, but how the firms are able to do that is going to differ by market structure. When it comes to production and profits for the firm, the goal of the firm, once again, is to maximize profits. And it doesn't matter what type of firm we're dealing with. If the firm is in competition, if the firm is in monopoly, if the firm is in one of those in-between types of market structures, it does not matter. We are looking at the same goal. And the profit maximizing firm has to consider its revenues. Of course it has to consider its revenues, but it also has to consider its costs. How much does it cost me to produce something? The more I produce, the more it costs. The more I produce and sell, the more revenues I can earn. So where's the balance? That's what we're going to be looking at. So, as we look into competition, let's try to understand here more about the competitive market, and then we'll start to put in place this idea of maximizing profits and how that fits together. Okay, in competition, we have lots of buyers and sellers. Lots and lots and lots of buyers and sellers. In fact, there are so many buyers and sellers that no single buyer or seller can affect what's going on in the market, really. What I mean by that is that each one of these buyers and sellers are so small. They consume and produce such a small part of the market that nobody really has the ability to swing prices in their favor. Firms are selling similar, really similar, if not identical goods. So there's very little product differentiation. It's easy to get into and out of the market. So there's free entry and exit. In other words, there are very limited barriers to entry. Finally, firms are price takers. Now, this means that the firm has no control over the market price. Like I mentioned, the firms are just too small to alter the market price. And so they have to take that price as given. They have to just accept it. And if they don't, then they're going to find that they have no customers, or that they're not making enough money to cover their costs. Remember how the market sets the price. So here we have our space, we have our market quantity and price, we have our demand curve, and we have our supply curve. And where the two lines cross, we have our equilibrium price. Well, that's the price that each firm in the market has to take. And each firm is going to have a portion of the market quantity. So when we're looking at the market, and the intersection of demand and supply, we're setting the market price and the market quantity. And we're setting the price that the firm has to take. That's this price right here. If they try to set a price that's higher than that, then their customers just go to the competitive, their competition and buy the products from the competition because the price is lower. And if they try to sell at a price lower than this price, then they're not going to be able to cover their cost of production and they'll go out of business. This is the only price the firm can sell for and stay in business. That makes them a price taker. This actually makes the job of the firm a little bit easier, even though it sounds like being a price taker is not the greatest thing in the world. If the firm doesn't have to worry about setting prices, then what they can do is just focus their attention on setting output and how much to produce. So finding the profit maximizing output is the real trick for the firm. They don't have to worry about the price. All they have to worry about is what output should I produce that's going to maximize my profits. So let's look at that. How do we calculate and maximize profits? Well, the first thing we need to know is we need to figure out what is marginal revenue. Well, we've talked about this before, at least in terms of margins. Marginal revenue, which will pretty much just abbreviate MR from here on out. Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue, so that's delta TR, remember the delta is change, divided by the change in quantity. So, for example, if we have total revenue of, say, 1,000, when we produce 100 units, and if we produce that 101st unit and total revenue goes up to 1,010, then here's our change in quantity. Delta Q is equal to 1. We've gone from 100 up to 101. And here's our change in total revenue. That is equal to 10. We go from 1,000 up to 1,010. So the marginal revenue is equal to 10 over 1, or just 10. Again, we're going to try to keep the change in quantity always equal to 1, just to make the math simpler. Just your job is to get the basics of what this concept of marginal revenue means, and so we don't have to complicate it with a lot of with the mathematics, with the arithmetic. Marginal revenue is just the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. The other margin that we're interested in here, of course, is marginal cost. And that is the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. So if our total cost of production goes from, say, 800 when we produce 100 units to, let's say, 805 when we produce the 101st unit, now we can just put those numbers that, here's the change in quantity, and that's equal to 1. And here's the change in total cost. That's equal to 5, because we go from 800 up to 805. And we just substitute those numbers in. So our change in total cost was 5. Our change in total quantity, our change in quantity was 1, or our change in output. And so that gives us a marginal cost of 5. So that's the process by which we calculate marginal revenue and marginal cost, and we need those numbers. If you remember from our last session, the profit maximizing rule focuses on the relationship between marginal revenue and marginal cost. Those are the things we need to figure out so we can figure out the profit maximizing output. So We're going to use this information now to try to find that profit maximizing output. There's one other distinguishing feature in competition that's important to note at this point, and that is the relationship between price and marginal revenue. Remember, firms in competition are price takers. We've talked about what this means. They have to take the market price. Because they have to take the market price, that means that every unit they sell, every sale they make, occurs at the market price. That means that if they want to sell 100 units, they sell it at the market price. If they want to sell 101 units, they sell it at the market price. If they want to sell 1,000 units, they're going to sell it at the market price. So each time you sell something, your revenues increase by the market price, which means that price is equal to marginal revenue, but only in competition. In competition, because you don't have any power over price, every sale you make is at the same price. So that marginal revenue, the additional revenue from selling one more unit, has to equal the price. This is an important characteristic in competition. So when you see data, and if the price and the marginal revenue are always the same, you know you're in competition. Let me show you what I mean. So here is a whole bunch of data. This is data for a company. And let's say that they are, let's say that this is a company that mows lawns for people in a neighborhood. We can look at this and tell a lot of information. The first thing we can see is that the price is equal to $100. And we know that because of what's going on in this column right here. This is our total revenue column. Total revenue is price times quantity. And we have our quantity information. So if we have a quantity of 1, to get total revenue of 100, we need to multiply that by the price. So 1 times 100 gives us our total revenue. If we increase output to 2, well, it's 2 times the price of 100. That gives us our total revenue of 200. And price is always the same. All the way down, all we're doing is taking price times quantity. Total cost, this column here, these are just the costs of production. These are the costs that your company has to pay. Now notice there's a cost here if you have an output equal to 0. We talked about this idea last time as well. This is your fixed cost. So no matter how much output you produce, you still have this fixed cost. Maybe this is the rental fee that you pay for your mowers, or maybe this is just the price you have to pay when you buy your lawn equipment. This is your monthly payment and you have a contract. This is fixed and it doesn't matter how much output you produce. When we go to producing an output of 1, notice that the cost goes up. Now that means you're paying workers, you're paying for gasoline, you're paying for transportation. Your variable costs will be the difference between whatever your total cost is and your $250 in fixed costs. Now that's getting a little bit too much into the weeds on costs, but that's what we're dealing with here. Once you start to produce, you have some variable costs that you could get rid of if you stopped producing. Of course, you're not going to make any money if you stop producing, so that may not be the best idea in the world. Total revenue is your column right here. Total cost is right here, and then profit is just the difference between total revenue and total cost. So in these areas here shaded in blue, we have just our basic profit calculation. That tells us total revenues, it tells us total cost, it tells us profitability, but it doesn't really help us to identify profit maximization, at least not in the way we've been discussing it. I mean, you could look down the profit column and find where the profit is the highest and say, well, that's how much output you produce. But here's the problem. Most firms don't have this information handed to them in a spreadsheet. They need to figure this profit maximization out in a different way because they're not going to know what their total costs are. They may not know what those total costs are until into the future. So what we're going to do is move into these next two columns to look at the margins. Remember, marginal revenue is the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. So if we look at total revenue at 1, total revenue is 100. Here we are right here. When we go to 2, total revenue is 200. So our change in quantity is just 1. So this is our delta Q. And our change in total revenue is the difference between these two numbers. So if we can get that in there, small change in TR. So we take that change, 100, divided by our change in quantity, which is 1, and that gives us our marginal revenue of 100. In fact, at any output, as we increase output by 1 unit, because we're changing total revenue just by the price, the marginal revenue is always 100. And like I said before, that means that the marginal revenue is equal to price. So we know what the price is. We know it's 100. Here it is. Every change in quantity yields us another $100 in revenue. That's why this column is always 100. Now our marginal cost is the change in total cost divided by change in quantity. Now let's go here. We see the change in output is still 1. We go from 0 to 1. And our change in cost is 90. This is our delta total cost. We go from 250 up to 340. That's an increase in cost of 90, and that's our marginal cost. But it's not always the same when we're talking about costs. Costs are different things. So when we go from an output of 1 to an output of 2, the change in total cost actually goes down. And it goes down primarily, so it goes from 90 when we had an output of 0 to an output of 1. Then we go from an output of 1 to an output of 2. Our total cost goes from 340 to 410. That's a change in 70. So here's our marginal cost. And notice that the marginal cost goes down for a while. And then it starts to go up. The primary reason for that is specialization. Where people start to work together, they become more efficient, they use their comparative advantages. But at some point, remember we have diminishing marginal productivity? Well, that's what's going on here. As the marginal cost goes up, we're experiencing diminishing marginal productivity. So the relationship between productivity and cost is that when productivity increases, marginal cost falls. But when marginal product starts to diminish, because productivity is per additional worker is smaller and smaller, then costs start to climb. So in our last column here, we are looking at change in profit. Change in profit can be looked at from two different ways. We can look at marginal revenue minus marginal cost, and that tells us whether profits are increasing or decreasing. Or we could look at the change in profit. So our profit column from over here, we can look at the change in profit and divide it by the change in output. Again, change in output is always 1. So we're just looking at what happens to profits as we increase our output. For a firm looking to increase production, or looking to find that profit maximizing output, it's important that every time you increase output, that profit increases. If it decreases, then you don't want to be producing those things. So in the green boxes here, we have our marginal revenue, it's always 100. We have our marginal cost, which is always less than the marginal revenue, which means that our profits, our change in profit is always positive. It's going up, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. Now here you might think, well, it's starting to increase, it's going down. That's not right. Profits are still increasing. They're just increasing more slowly. So as long as this number is positive, the firm wants to increase production. Where the firm doesn't want to increase production is in this area here. Look at what happens. If we increase production from 8 units to 9 units of output, look what happens to profit. Profit was 100, now it's minus 50. The reason for that is that costs start to climb really, really quickly here. We're losing all of the advantages of specialization. We may have to drive just too far out into the boondocks to provide services. There's all kinds of reasons why the costs might go up. Maybe you're overusing your equipment and now you have to pay for more maintenance. Whatever the case may be, costs have just jumped up, and now the marginal cost is higher than the marginal revenue, so that our change in profit is negative. Ooh, that's bad. And if we increase output again to 10 units, oh my, profits are even more negative. Our change in profit, it's so powerfully negative, it doesn't make any sense to service these numbers of customers, because it's just too expensive to do that. So here's our table of data without all of the lines and calculations. Perhaps you've noticed we have the green area up here, where profits are increasing as we increase output. And we had our red area down here, where profits are decreasing as we increase output. In fact, we're at these levels, it's not just that profits are decreasing, it's that we're actually losing money. And that there was one particular area where we didn't talk about. That's this area right here, this row right here. Because this is the goal of the firm. The firm wants to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's where the profit maximization occurs. Now we can see that in a couple of different ways. One is that we can see that the change in profit is 0. What that means is that if you increase output up until this point, you have captured all of the potential gains in profit. There aren't any more. So that's one place we can see this. The other place we can see this is right here, where profit is 100, and that's the highest profit amount anywhere. You might ask yourself, what about this profit here? Why wouldn't that be the profit maximization point? And the reason for that is because of over here. Your change in profit is still positive, and you don't know for sure that you've reached the profit maximization point because there's still profit being earned. You want to be right here where there's no more profit to be gained. That's where you are 100% sure you know you have maximized profit. Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, where the additional revenues are the same as the additional costs. Now it might be easier to see this on a graph. So let's take a look at basically this data plotted out in a graph. So we're going to draw our space for the graph, but it's going to be a little bit different than what we've seen before. We're going to have quantity here. And then on our vertical axis, we're going to put basically anything to do with a dollar sign. So this will be price information and cost information and revenue information. All of that stuff, any dollar values are going to be found on our vertical axis. The first line I want to draw in is our marginal revenue line. That's the easiest line to draw in because it's just equal to price. It's just this nice flat line. I'm going to label it as MR, but I also know it's my price because price and marginal revenue are always the same in competition. And if you remember from our table, that was $100. So that's marginal revenue and that's price. Now, I'm also going to draw in my marginal cost curve. I'm just going to sketch this in. If you go back to the table, you'll see that this is the general shape of a marginal cost curve. It goes down for a little while, but then it starts to climb back up. So it sort of looks like a Nike swoosh. That's our marginal cost, and that's the general shape of all marginal cost curves. For the firm interested in maximizing profits, at low outputs down here, so here's 1 and 2 and 3, at low outputs, as long as that marginal revenue curve is above the marginal cost curve, it makes sense for the firm to increase production. Here at 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, all of these output levels generate positive profit because the additional revenue is above the additional cost of production. In fact, we could sort of color all of this area in here and say, when a firm is trying to decide how much output to produce, as long as we're in this area, you continue to produce because it yields more revenue than it costs you. Once you go beyond that, however, once you go past that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, now the marginal cost for all of these units of output, marginal cost is above marginal revenue, which means every unit costs you more to produce than you receive in income. So it's too expensive now for you to produce. And if you're producing out here at Unit 9 and Unit 10, you're losing money on production. The only place where you can be guaranteed of having made as much profit as you possibly can is right here at 8 units of output. And that is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. There's no more profit to be gained. If you're to the left of 8, so if you're down here at 4, well, you can make more profit. You just need to increase your output. So if your output is below where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, down here at like an output of 4, you should increase production. Increase your production because you can earn more profits. If output is above that, though, if output is greater than where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, then you should reduce your production because you're losing money for every unit that you sell. This is the profit maximization rule. This is trying to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and setting your output at that level. Your price is given. You can't make any changes there. And if you do, you're going out of business. You can only choose the output. And to maximize profits, this is the rule that firms should follow. There is one other thing we need to add. one other little detail that we've kind of ignored up until this point. So sadly, we have one more type of cost to introduce, and then I think we're done with our various costs. The most important cost is still marginal cost. But this other cost that we're about to introduce, it's kind of a close second. It's something we call average total cost. So let's explore that one before we make any firm conclusions about whether a business is earning profits. So how do we know for sure if a firm is earning profits? Well, we've been talking about the profit maximizing condition as being the output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But for profits to truly be earned, we need one other condition to be met. And that is that this final type of cost, called average total cost, has to actually be below price. So the average total cost must be below price for profits to be earned. Because that profit maximizing condition can be looked at in another way. Marginal revenue equaling marginal cost could also identify something we call the loss minimization output. The loss minimization output occurs when a firm is losing money. They want to lose as little as possible. And our marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that can also help a firm lose as little as possible. This would be the case if average total cost is greater than price. Okay, so what's average total cost? How do we calculate it? And what does it look like? That's the most logical next step here. How do we know if there's profit? Well, we need to know average total cost. Average total cost is the total cost of production divided by the output that is produced. So notice we're not looking at changes here. This is not marginal cost. This is the total cost of production, the total cost divided by whatever output amount you are producing. And if the price is greater than average total cost at a particular output, then there is profit. And the maximum profit will occur by producing the output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So let's take a look at this in a graph. We're just going to add one more curve to our graph to identify where profit is truly being made. Okay, so here we go with our graph. Again, we'll have quantity here, and we're going to have our dollar values up here. And let's put in our marginal revenue curve first. That nice flat line. So here's marginal revenue, and we know marginal revenue is equal to price. Now we're going to put in our marginal cost curve. So there's our marginal cost. We know where profit maximization or loss minimization will occur. That occurs where the two lines cross. But to identify for sure whether or not there's a profit or a loss, we need to know where the average total cost curve is. So average total cost just looks like a kind of a big sort of smiley face, a big U shape. And so we're going to draw this in right here. And that is our average total cost curve. So we want to go to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That is the point we know where either profits are maximized or losses are minimized. So we drop down, and that's going to be our quantity. That's the quantity that the firm should produce. To know if we have profits or losses, we need to see what's the relationship between the price and the average total cost. In other words, is the blue line above the green line? And at that output, it is. If we draw this across, we see that our average total cost is below price. So we know that this firm is earning a profit. This firm is profitable. Yay, we're happy. Profits are being earned. The amount of profit, the specific amount of profit, can be computed, if you remember geometry, by calculating the area of this rectangle. We're not going to do that, but you could if you wanted to, and in microeconomics we probably would. This is referred to just simply as the profit box. There is a profit being earned because price is above average total cost. Okay, so this firm is profitable. Their price is above average total cost. They've set their output so that they're maximizing profit. And here's where the trouble comes in for the firm. Because remember, we are dealing with a competitive market. And there's easy entry and exit into the market. So, if one firm is earning profits, it's kind of acting like a magnet to other firms. It's sending this broadcast out, letting everybody know, hey, we are earning profits. And maybe you could earn profits too if you entered this market with us. Nuts. It's easy to enter and exit a competitive market. So, if one firm is earning profits, it's going to attract other firms. And what's going to happen is what we call competing the profits away. This is bad news for a firm in competition. It's really hard to be in a competitive market. So, let's take a look at the details here and then look at a graph of how this whole process works out. As I just mentioned, in competitive markets, exit and entry, and in this case, entry, is really easy. If somebody's earning profits, it's going to attract competition. Other firms are going to want to enter the market because, hey, if that guy can earn profit, well, I surely can too. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is that if firms are not making profit, they're likely to exit. So if there are too many firms, if firms are losing money, people will start to leave. And this movement of firms into and out of the market has an impact on the overall size of the market. No single firm can affect the price, but if there are firms moving into and out of the market, that's necessarily going to change the market price. The firms themselves can't voluntarily charge a higher price, but if they leave, that's going to affect the overall market supply, which will cause the supply curve to shift, and that will change the market price. When we look at competition, and we look at the graph for competition, there are actually two graphs that we focus on. The first, and we've actually drawn both of these already, now we're just going to put them together. The first graph is our market graph. So this is where the price gets set. The second graph is the graph for the individual firm. So the individual business gets its own graph. And so on this graph, remember, we have our dollar values up here. In the market graph, we're just looking at setting price. So let's do that. Here's our supply curve in the market. Here's our demand curve in the market. And the market price is determined by where those two lines intersect. So here's our market price. We're just going to label that with a capital letter P. And then we're going to take that market price over to our firm. Hey, remember the firm is a price taker? Well, now here they are taking the market price. And at that price, we draw our familiar flat line, which is the price and the marginal revenue. So that's how we get that price marginal revenue line. Okay, now we draw in our marginal cost curve. And there it is, marginal cost. Lastly, we're going to draw in our average total cost curve. So here is average total cost. So this graph on the right, this firm graph, it's the same graph that we saw just a couple of slides ago. But now we have it set up against the market. The firm on the right, the firm who is in the market, we know they are earning profits. They're going to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost right here. They're going to set their output here. We're going to call this Q1 for the firm. That's their profit maximizing output. And we know they're earning profit because price is greater than marginal cost. So for now, price is greater than average total cost. That means they're profitable. But what that's going to do is that's going to attract other firms to this market. And so if new firms start to enter the market, what happens? Well, in the market, the supply curve is going to shift. As we have new firms, one of our supply shifters was how many firms are in the market. And so we have this shift in supply to the right that increases supply, but look what happens to price. Now, the new equilibrium price is here. Call this P2. P2 is lower than P1, and so this is bad for the profit maximizing firm because that firm is a price taker. They take the market price. Well, the market price has just changed. Look what happens now. Our new price, and consequently our new marginal revenue, is now lower than it was before. So is this firm earning a profit anymore? Well, the answer to that depends upon the relationship between price and average total cost. Here is our new intersection. That's where marginal revenue, the new marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. And it looks like that they're about at the same point as the average total cost. So a couple of things here. First of all, the quantity that the firm produces falls. The profit maximizing quantity for the firm falls. They're not producing as much. Secondly, now at this lower price, we're not here anymore. We are now at the point where price equals average total cost. I mentioned this term before, and I said we'd come back to it. Well, now we're coming back to it. This is what we call break even. When price equals average total cost, the firm is breaking even. They're not earning profits, but they're not losing money either. They're breaking even. Now you might ask yourself, do you want to break even? And the answer to that question is, well, part of your costs are paying yourself as the owner. So any added profits, that's just kind of gravy. That's icing on the cake. Here you're earning an income. It's not that you're earning nothing. It's that you're just not earning profits above your cost of production. Now, if firms were to continue to enter this market, let's say that supply shifted way out here to S3, look what happens to price. Price once again drops. So there's P3. And in this case, at P3, now you're losing money. At P3, price is less than average total cost. You're not breaking even, you're losing money, and you may want to get out of the market at this point. Your loss minimizing output would be right here. So Q3 would be the loss minimizing output. You're losing money because price is less than average total cost. So to lose the least amount, you want to produce at Q3. All right, so let's put this in context here as we wrap up. Competitive markets are really, really hard. In fact, in competitive markets, you're not going to be able to maintain significant economic profits because it is so easy to enter and exit the market. The best you can do in the long run is to break even. So why would you want to be in an industry like that? The answer is, of course, you don't. But whenever we look at economic profit, it's taking implicit costs into account. So the profits we're talking about here are economic in nature. So even if you earn zero economic profit, all of your implicit costs, which means your opportunity costs, are being covered. So you could go work somewhere else and earn money. That's your implicit cost. That's covered. So your explicit costs are covered, your implicit costs are covered. So just the fact that you are breaking even isn't a bad thing. It just means that you're not earning anything above what you could be earning at another alternative option, at another job, in another occupation. So to wrap up, competition. Free entry means that anyone can enter the industry whenever there are profit opportunities, and you're going to see that entry happen. So whenever there are profitable firms, it increases market supply, driving down prices and reducing profits. Of course, if the industry is experiencing losses, then firms leave. Then supply falls, prices go up, and it increases profits for remaining firms, or at least brings them back to profitability. Unfortunately, in the long run, so over time, the best a firm in competition can do is to break even. The last thing I want to say about competition is this. In competitive markets, the reason that economists like competition is because it provides more output and does so at lower prices than any other market structure. And this is good if our goal is to deal with scarcity. In fact, this is very, very good for consumers. We want competition. But it's really hard for producers. Producers find competitive markets to be incredibly difficult. There are so many other options for the consumer, and prices are so low. Nevertheless, for the overall society, competition generates the most welfare. Remember those consumer and producer surpluses? They're still maximized in this market structure. The market structure at the other extreme is called monopoly, and this is the one economists look at and they say, I'm not so sure about this one. Because what we're going to see is that monopoly leads to higher prices, lower output, and less well-being for society as a whole. So that's competition. I know there's a lot there, there's a lot going on, there's a lot of graphs and things to consider. Competition is kind of the gold standard of market structure, though. As we look at market structure and what we want from our economy, we want competition. There's so many valuable things, so many valuable attributes that competition has. It's great for consumers, to be sure, but it also drives producers to produce new things, to produce them better, to produce them more efficiently, so that they can get so that they can get ahead of their competition. Now, those gains are not going to last very long, but the gains are still valuable and tangible to the business. So, one of the things that you might notice in policy is the effort of policymakers to promote competition. We call this antitrust. And antitrust laws are in place to try to ensure that there's more competition in a market and that monopoly power isn't allowed to persist. So as we start to move into monopoly now, we're going to take a look at the basics of monopoly. We're going to look at what is, what are the problems that monopoly creates, just the basic functionings of how a monopolistic market works. But remember, monopolies are, for the most part, they're not good. This is why we have a set of law, antitrust law, that fights against monopolies. And in fact, if you're interested in the law, antitrust law is a pretty good place to land yourself, because antitrust cases are incredibly complicated and they last a long time. And so you've got pretty good job security as an antitrust lawyer. So we're going to move into monopoly the next time we get together. But for now, work on those graphs. Sit down and sketch those things out. Replicate what we've done in here so that you can get more comfortable with that. Those graphs are not things that come naturally to people. You need to practice them. It's like practicing the clarinet or practicing kicking a soccer ball. Sketch those graphs out. See if you can move the lines. So if there's an increase in supply or a decrease in supply, see what happens to price and see what happens to profitability of the firm. So until next time, practice those graphs and we'll get back together and take a look at monopoly.